How can the environment be racist? Well, alone it cannot, but the people and policies that control environmental resources and disposal of hazardous materials can. From the water crisis in Flint to the differences in lifespans across wards in DC. Today, we're talking about environmental racism and how to make resources and ecological sustainability available to all communities. Here on Speak Out DC.
What is environmental racism? It is when communities of color are exposed to environmental hazards and pollution because of discriminatory policies and practices. Addressing this form of toxic discrimination will help dismantle oppressive systems that harm those communities most impacted by the lack of clean water, land, and air. Fighting for more ecological, sustainable communities and neighborhoods is the key to eradicating environmental racism and ensuring equitable access to a cleaner, greener future for all.
Welcome to Speak Out DC. I'm your host, DC Youth Mayor Addison Rose. Joining me today are Brittany Drakeford, a PhD candidate in urban and regional planning at the University of Maryland, College Park. Kamal Lewis, a government affairs administrative associate who has written an article on environmental racism, and DC high school student Jessica Smith. Let's start by defining environmental racism. What does it mean?
Environmental racism is simply described as a phenomena where there is inequality in communities, specifically based on the built environment and natural resources in a community. And so the built environment and natural resources create all types of adverse conditions, such as adverse health outcomes, adverse life expectancy differences, air quality differences as well. And
so why is this important, guys?
Because it affects all of us, especially if you're part of a minority community. Right here in DC, even though we're a rich cultural city, there's still discrepancies on how people live across all the wards, especially in the 5th ward where there's a lot of industrial and zoned land here. So a lot of people have to deal with the health consequences that come with having industry right next door.
This is important to me because as we are growing as a society, we are industrializing, and that does come with the issue of, well, that is one of the main issues of environmental racism. And it also creates disproportionate health effects. And if we want to become a more united and, I guess, consistent society and community as in the future, we need to comply and recognize the issue.
So how do we acknowledge this issue exists? Where do we go? How do we actually change the issue and make it so that it doesn't happen again?
Yeah, so some of the work that I do as an urban planner really looks at different policies. You mentioned zoning. So looking at zoning ordinances, looking at using maps, first to identify where we see certain forms of environmental racism. And so as Kamal mentioned, environmental racism can look like everything from high concentrations of industrial uses like power plants, or maybe even if there are stormwater runoff where there might be maybe sewage and stormwater, that's also an environmental concern. But it also looks at like healthy food access, or are there sidewalks in communities? So as urban planners, one of the first things that we look to do is to first identify where we see communities where environmental racism is present, and then speaking out and talking to people to see how we can work on policy solutions and policy changes.
And Kamal, we kind of off air talked about what you are looking to do in the future as a career. Can you kind of talk about what that is and how it relates to what we're talking about today in environmental racism?
Well, I want to become an advocate for public transportation, and it's all interconnected with environmental racism, because at the end of the day, we're talking about the environment. So I want to create cities, or advocate for better cities that are better designed for everyone that lives in them. So people across different financial or social classes have equal and fair access to clean, safe, efficient public transportation.
Yeah, great. And Jessica, how about you? What do you want to do, and how does that kind of maybe align with what we're talking about?
Well, I want to be a medical malpractice lawyer. And in that sector, there is a great disproportionality of, mortality rates and I guess success when it comes to treatments and certain things. And another issue is also the resources we have to combat the environmental racism that already exists and that we're experiencing already. And a lot of times people do not have the tools, the resources to legally advocate for themselves when they have been, I guess, violated in a sense, especially when it comes to environmental racism, but more in the medical area.
Yeah. So where do we mainly see this? We see this, so we kind of talked about the Flint water crisis. Are we saying that could have been prevented?
Yeah, I mean, the Flint water crisis certainly could have been prevented. We had people who were in power who made policy decisions that created the condition where they did not invest in the water infrastructure, the infrastructure system in that community in an equitable and safe way. And people actually made a decision in not treating the water properly, which then created a long-term impact. And so, yes, we can make changes, and that is part of the ways in which this created.
And so what are some of the other ways that we kind of see this?
I would say coming forth to your public officers, the people that are in power, just as the young lady did in the Flint water crisis to get the White House's attention. And for her age, I think that was incredible. But what I have done as a citizen and as a young person, because one thing I am very concerned about is the future, and one of my big focuses on, because not only do we have to live with what exists in front of us, we have a future ahead of us, and we want to be able to do things to prevent, much worse conditions. And I've been to council meetings, and I've come there with my criticisms of the over-industrialization, the overdevelopment of cities. And for DC personally, I think that we are creating a community in a space where it's not exactly necessary to the geography of our city specifically. New York, for example, is sinking because of the overdevelopment of those high towers. And I thought, although we do have a policy on how high our buildings can be, we are increasing the risk with the air quality and stuff like that. Construction is very much in the communities, especially in Ward 6 and Ward 8, and it's becoming a great health risk.
So Kamal, what do you think we should do about it? What do you think are some different angles we can kind of take to combat this issue?
Like my previous guest have said, all these issues are inherently local. So it's not been running it all the way up to the White House like they did in Flint, because that doesn't happen every day and can't happen. So just pleading with your local government, whether it be aldermen, council officials, or the mayor herself or himself in those situations, just advocating and making sure the information's known across the community, not even just within your small tight-knit group, but across neighborhoods, so people actually know what they're talking about when they talk about environmental racism or the health effects that come with it. Because at the end of the day, environmental racism destroys communities.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, I actually like kind of the point you said, kind of I think it's kind of hard to advocate for ourselves when we're not, we don't have enough knowledge on the issue. Do you all think that we need to do better as a community of being aware of the different things that are occurring so that we can kind of speak up for ourselves and advocate for the different things that we are enduring that we may not even know we are?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. As a practicing urban planner, one of the things that I would see most frequently at urban planning meetings, and a lot of these decisions are made at urban planning meetings, was that sometimes community members wouldn't be present. And that often made a huge impact as we were advancing policies or as we were advancing decisions or making policy recommendations and not necessarily hearing from community members. So one of the things that I was really committed to doing, and I still work on today in my free time, is doing what's called community walk audits. So I actually take community members, and I love hearing you all and working specifically with high school students and young people, and actually having them walk around their neighborhoods. We take photographs using a practice called Photo Voice, where we document what a condition is in a community. And then we take it and we walk and we write down every single thing we see. Then we use that information and we build a community map. And so then residents have the ability to advocate for their own solutions with policy officials.
Wow, that's great. Well, we're going to dig into the history of environmental racism and look into specific areas that people could be paying attention to more often when Speak Out DC returns. Welcome back to Speak Out DC. Environmental racism has been called the new Jim Crow. Why do you all think that is?
Because it destroys our communities, and it's inherently racial based and class based, because we see things like Flint happening all across communities in America. Flint is not the exception, it's the rule, sadly. A lot of communities are dying because they're located next to environmental hazards and they don't get the same news coverage.
Well, the Jim Crow, the laws put in place were to keep a community back. And it was put in place to, I guess, prevent them from gaining any sort of success and thrive in their communities as well. So when you put environmental factor, you're also affecting the health of these people. And also, the Jim Crow also put a mentality that you are not more than the community or the stipulations and scrutiny put on your community. And environmental racism, if you look at it, it does have on a mental aspect where you do think that this is all that is there for you. You think that there is trash. You think that all there is construction, but there is not for me. And you can see the effects of the health of people and think that that is your community's destiny. And some people are more susceptible to it. And that is a great issue.
Yeah. I will also add, and I think you all have brought out some really great points, that the new Jim Crow, as you mentioned, also focuses on this idea of segregating communities. And so that was some of the historic practices of Jim Crow. And so when we look at environmental racism, it really triggers back or harkens back to this idea of segregated communities. So the reason why some communities are overburdened with pollution versus others is because those communities have been racially segregated. Even today, our neighborhoods are still very much segregated by race and by class. And so in thinking about the former form of Jim Crow and versus the new form of Jim Crow, it really is this idea also that neighborhoods are segregated, which is why then certain burdens are applied to more communities or select communities, primarily African American and Brown and Latino communities more.
So as we kind of look at this idea of different communities, I hear that you've been researching a certain study. Kind of tell me about that and how it relates to what we've been talking about.
Yeah, so the Metropolitan Washington Council of Government, so that's again one of those institutions that you should familiarize yourself with if you want to start to advocate for dismantling or addressing environmental racism, released a report called Uneven Opportunities. And what it revealed was that in the DC region, and specifically in Washington, D.C., there's a 27-year life expectancy difference from people who live in Georgetown versus people who live in the Trinidad neighborhood. Oh, so someone who lives in Georgetown would live on average to the age of 94, whereas someone who lives in the Trinidad neighborhood would be somewhere around like 72. And so that 27-year life expectancy difference is almost a generation that then becomes wiped out of communities.
Wow, and so why is that?
Well, because of some
resources.
of the things, because some of the resources, it could be because of chronic illnesses like hypertension and diabetes. So when we see high rates of air pollution, yes, people might have asthma, but the consequences or the long-term impact of having asthma is that you also develop other types of respiratory illnesses, or it might make it more difficult for you to breathe, or maybe you might be experiencing forms of chronic stress. Something that my mother actually experienced, not necessarily stress, but a disease called sarcoidosis, which was primarily driven by the environmental factors in her neighborhood, which actually led her to pass away at the age of 44.
So looking from the academic or the scientific perspective, what are solutions other than advocating, of course, bringing up the issue to those in public office? What are the solutions that are being
Well, that's a great question, and I would say that I think a lot of them are still very policy driven, right? A lot of solutions are going to be policy driven, but we can also make choices, maybe like choosing to bike more, or maybe choosing to not drive as many places, because a lot of times air pollution can be caused specifically through car emissions. In some places, people advocate for changing your diet. So maybe we don't eat as much meat, because meat is actually one of the largest drivers of air pollution in the United States and globally.
So when we kind of think about that, but we're also thinking about these specific communities and their lifespans, do you think one of the biggest things that contributes to this idea of, certain communities living longer is the resources that they have because of the money that they have? So like, for instance, like a Trader Joe's in less fortunate communities isn't really going to be used in comparison to communities that have the money to shop at a Trader Joe's. Do you think we need to do more with providing those opportunities, like fresh food and produce, to our underprivileged communities so that they are able to live as long and, do the same things that these other communities are?
Yeah, I think that is certainly a really great solution. And I think there are a lot of community members, particularly in Washington, D.C. now, who are doing a lot of work to help to bring healthy foods to neighborhoods where historically those have been missing. So finding new ways to increase healthy, fresh food options, finding ways to increase park space, right? Like, do people have safe places to play? Or are there lots of what we refer to as impervious surfaces, or areas where stormwater runs off? So finding ways to address those issues and changing some of those resources, and not just having those resources in communities that are predominantly wealthy.
Kamal, what do you think?
I think education is also a critical part of that, because you need to educate people how, what is the proper food to eat. What should my daily diet looks like, so I can live like a long and prosperous life.
Prosperous life.
Yeah.
We'll say that.
Oh man.
Where do you think that education goes? Does it go in the schools? Does it go through social media? We need to do more in our area with kind of helping our residents understand.
So I think it's three-pronged. So I think social media, it's a great way. School is another great way, but also community leaders, whether it be like a church leader, maybe a youth basketball coach, or other community leaders like that. Getting the information out, it's critical, so people know that there's healthy, cheap options for them to live a good life, rather than eating fast foods that will shorten their life and may come with more health complications down the line. Because the number one killer in America for all communities is heart disease, which is mostly caused by poor dieting.
Jessica, would you agree?
I agree. I think a very interesting, especially for our specific case in DC, when it comes to solutions, that we're often encouraged to take public transportation as opposed to our own cars. But the emissions of public transportation are also very highly concentrated as well. And if you consistently have construction maintenance and a lot of people taking those rides, it also increases the demand for the exact same, issues. That sort of contradicts the need for solutions against environmental racism. And I just think it's very unique, especially for DC. I know New York advertises that as well, but I was sort of thinking about that. I was like, is this really a situation is this a one solution situation, or is it two, intersectional maybe, that is so systemic that it's really hard to get out of it, especially when money is the factor of everything, and so is race.
Yeah. Please stay with us. More of our conversation on environmental racism when we come back. Welcome back. Jessica?
I've done some work this summer, just a little bit on epigenetics and cancer. However, epigenetics is the study of how your behavior in environment can affect the way your genes are being expressed. And when it comes to environmental racism, it does have an effect on the behaviors and the genetic predisposals. And your success with combating those environmental effects on how your body, works with it. So when we talk about the environment and the mentality taken on, that does have a direct effect on behavior. Your behavior can affect someone else's. Your behavior and your attitude towards your environment. Like I talked about earlier, about how when we see an environment, especially if you're in a more poverty-stricken area, how you think there's not more to than the area that you're confined to. And that also affects the next person that they're immediately connected to, and that also creates a genetic stress as well that you spoke about earlier, and your behaviors, the smoking, and you know that certain, I guess, libations and other items are more used in certain areas like poverty-stricken areas, so liquor and probably cigarettes, you know, have a genetic effect as well, depending on how many times you use them, and I guess concentrate it into a whole community.
Yeah, I would also add, to that point, so the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has done some really interesting research that explores how healthy a person is. And what they determined was that about 20% of how healthy an individual is at any given time is based off of environmental factors. Another 30 to 40% is based off of what they refer to as the social determinants of health, or things like access to housing, or access to safe housing, access to transportation.
And this is physical or mental health, or like all together?
All together.
Huh.
Even, as was mentioned, genetics then factors about another 20% as well. So how healthy a person is at any given moment is typically about 30% based off of how their choices, but most of how healthy we are, and even in thinking about environmental racism, it really is determined based off of the conditions and the environment around us.
Right.
Wow, that's interesting. So when we kind of look at kind of our communities as a whole and our environment and kind of how that affects us, is there anything that we can personally do to make sure that, at least for ourselves, we are not succumbing to the negative effects of our communities? What would you say, Kamal?
I say, you know, maybe one day instead of driving to work, maybe you bike or even take the metro if that's an option.
Be more proactive.
Yeah, maybe you decide to just say, let's just say today I'm not going to eat meat. I'm just going to eat vegetables and fruits to limit our own, you know, small impact on the environment as a whole. So just making small personal life choices that go a long way into bettering your community, but also most importantly, bettering yourself as a person. So it takes a little bit of personal responsibility, but it's also important to acknowledge that, like, you're in control of your own life. You can determine, you know, what goes into your body, what goes out of it.
Though there is a lot of, you know, factors that contribute to it around us, there is still a lot we could be doing for ourselves. Would you agree?
I agree, and I think also acknowledging that although they are the big guys up top, the men on the 85th floor, I think that we have to remember that the consumer does have the power, and we have things like neighborhood commissions and such that also determine what goes in and out of your community. And I think that the more that we collaborate and we make each other aware of this issue, because I will be completely transparent, of all the things I learned about systematic racism or issues of my community, environmental racism was probably one of the last I learned about. And it became a very interesting topic because it's just like all the factors into oppressing certain people have everything to do with everything on this planet, and the environment was the last thing I would have thought about. Flooding people's houses and neighborhoods and over construction. I think that idea came in, I guess, that my amazement with it, because I was living it every day, and I saw how my city evolved and how my schools evolved and how important were the things I was learning about planting rice in the Anacostia and, you know, composting. I just thought it was worms and dirt, but it's much more to that, and I think we need to pass that on.
I think we need to try transforming the communities we live in. And this is more on a larger scale. So making sure they're walkable, making sure there's tree coverage outside the urban canopy, which is the concept of, you know, when you're walking on the sidewalk, is there a tree above you that's covering? Because especially when it's hot out, you know, people tend to, you know, stay inside, but, you know, people need to go outside and experience the city and also exercise. So that's important. And making sure our communities have proper access to public transportation, whether that be, you know, buses or, you know, trains, or even other types of micro mobility, like those scooters you see around, or Capital bike share bikes. You know, it's all connected within each other.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to add, I feel like one of the other things that has been so important and throughout history and how people have fought against environmental racism is to have hope and to have a positive spirit and to believe that their neighborhoods and communities can change. And once people have hope in their communities, they seem to be more active and more willing to actually start making some of those changes and do some of those personal and also community changes.
So when we kind of talk about hope, do you think that we should kind of stop being so negative towards our communities? Is that what you mean? Kind of and like believe that we truly can change, things can be different?
Yeah, certainly. Believe that your community can change and believe that you do have power and agency to make those changes in your community as well.
Yeah, great. Well, this has certainly been an enlightening discussion. I'd like to thank my guests, Kamal Lewis, Jessica Smith, and Brittany Drakeford. And thank you for watching. I'm DC Youth Mayor Addison Rose. Remember, let your voice be heard. Speak out, DC.